You held the urn in your hands, you felt how strangely light it was, and a question crept up that you were almost afraid to say out loud. If there is nothing left but ashes, can Jesus still raise that person whole? I asked it too. And the answer I found did not come from a modern preacher or a slick book. It came from a Bible older than the King James, carried across an ocean in a wooden trunk, and it answers that question without a single flicker of doubt. Yes, he can, and the proof is written in the bodies of people who were burned down to nothing more than 500 years ago, and who died still believing they would rise again whole and complete. That certainty survived in a German Bible the Amish still trust more than the one on most American shelves. It survived because the people who carried it had watched their own families turn to ash and refused to believe that ash was the end. I am going to show you a book printed in Zurich in the year 1531 by a man named Christoph Froschauer. I am going to show you one word that word for word English Bibles quietly dropped. And I am going to show you a record book, thick as a brick, that names the burned by name. I remember the first time this hit me. I was standing in a small cemetery in Holmes County, Ohio, on a gray afternoon, looking at rows of plain white markers, every single one the same size, the rich man and the poor man given the exact same stone. And I thought, these people know something about death that the rest of us paid a fortune to forget. Ah, this is for you, whether you have already buried someone you love, whether you are holding an urn right now, or whether you are quietly deciding what should happen to your own body one day. Stay with me, because what these plain people believe about the cremated is not a comfort blanket, it is an argument, and it holds. Let me start with the thing that first stopped me cold. The Amish do not cremate. Not almost, never, never. In more than 300 years of Amish life in America, you will not find it as an accepted practice in any old order community. Now, I assume the reason was simple squeamishness, old habit, fear of fire. That is what I would have guessed, and I would have been wrong. Because here is the paradox that broke my assumption wide open. The very people who refuse to burn their dead are the spiritual descendants of people who were burned alive. Their own ancestors, the early Anabaptists, were tied to stakes and set on fire by the hundreds. If anyone had reason to believe that fire could destroy a soul's hope of resurrection, it was them. Their grandparents were smoke, and yet they never once taught that those burned martyrs were lost. Not one hymn, not one sermon, not one line in their record book suggests that the ashes of the faithful were beyond God's reach. In fact, they taught the opposite, and they taught it louder than anyone. So why, if burning cannot separate a believer from resurrection, do the Amish still refuse to be cremated? That contradiction is the whole mystery, and to solve it, I had to go back to the book they read it from. The Bible most Amish and Mennonite families historically trusted was not the English King James. It was the German Bible printed by Christoph Froschauer in Zurich, first in parts in the 1520s and complete by 1531. This was the Bible of the Swiss Brethren, the early Anabaptists, and it came to Pennsylvania in the 1700s, tucked among the few possessions these families were allowed to carry. Froschauer himself was no quiet bystander. He printed for the reformers. He was dragged in front of the authorities for breaking a fasting rule at a famous meal of sausages in 1522. And he kept printing scripture in the common tongue when doing so could cost a man everything. His Bible was a working man's Bible, plain German, words a farmer could read by candlelight. And in that Bible, in the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians, there is a stretch of verses that answers our question directly. The Apostle Paul is arguing with people who cannot imagine how a dead, decayed body could ever live again. And Paul does not dodge them. He tells them they are asking the wrong question. He says the body that is buried is like a bare seed. You do not plant an apple when you plant an apple tree. You plant a small, dry kernel that looks nothing like what comes up. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. Sown in corruption, raised in incorruption. Sown in weakness, raised in power. Now hold on to that word, sown, because here is the clue that took me days to chase down. In the older German and the older English, the word for burial in that passage is a farming word. It does not mean discarded. It does not mean thrown away. It means planted deliberately, with expectation of a harvest. A modern reader skims right past it. But a farmer, and every early Anabaptist was a farmer, heard that word in his hands and his back. He knew exactly what it meant to put something small and dead into the dark ground and wait for God to bring it up transformed. To those people, a grave was not a garbage pit. It was a furrow. There is a volume that sits in many Amish and Mennonite homes right beside the Bible, and in some homes it is read almost as often. It is called the Martyrs' Mirror. Its full compiling was done by a Dutch preacher named Thieleman J. van Braght, and it was first published in the Dutch language in the year 1660. It is enormous, more than 1,000 pages, and nearly all of it is the recorded deaths of Christians, going back to the early church and forward through the Anabaptist persecutions of the 1500s. Page after page, it names people burned at the stake, not vaguely, by name, by town, by year. Men and women who were bound, questioned, and set on fire because they would not renounce their faith and would not baptize their infants. One of them you may have heard of. His name was Dirk Willems, and he died in the year 1569 in the Netherlands. He had escaped his prison and was fleeing across a frozen pond. The guard chasing him fell through the ice, and Dirk Willems turned around, went back, and pulled the drowning man out. For that mercy he was recaptured, and shortly after he was burned to death over a slow fire. Think about what that means for our question. These were people who had every reason on earth to fear that fire would erase them. And in the letters they wrote from prison, letters preserved in that same book, they wrote to their spouses and children with total calm about seeing them again, about rising, about bodies made new. They watched the flame coming, and they did not believe it had any power over the resurrection. Why were they so sure? Because of a promise most people never notice, tucked into the writings of the prophets and repeated by Jesus himself. The claim of Scripture is not that God resurrects preserved bodies, it is that God creates. The same power that made a man out of the dust of the ground in the beginning does not need the dust to stay in one tidy pile. Dust that scatters is still dust, God knows. There is a passage in the book of Ezekiel, the 37th chapter, where the prophet is set down in a valley full of dry bones, not fresh bodies. Old, scattered, sun-bleached bones, long past decay, and God asks him, can these bones live? And then, breath by breath, sinew by sinew, God knits them back together into a living army. The whole point of that vision is that there is no such thing as too far gone, not for the one who made the body in the first place. So the martyrs burned, and their people never doubted they would rise. And that, finally, cracks our mystery open, but not the way you would expect. because it means the Amish refusal to cremate is not about fear that God cannot raise the ashes. They know He can. Their own family tree is proof they believe it. So the real question sharpened in my mind until it was almost uncomfortable. If they fully believe God can and will raise the cremated, then why do they still refuse cremation for themselves? What are they protecting? What did they understand that we lost? And this is where I have to introduce you to who benefited from us forgetting. For most of human history, and in every plain community to this day, the care of the dead belonged to the family and the neighbors. When an Amish person dies, there is no fleet of professionals. The body is washed and dressed by family members, often the same people who cared for them in their final illness. The men of the community dig the grave by hand with shovels. A plain box is built, usually of pine or poplar, sometimes by a neighbor who does nothing fancier than that. There is no embalming. There is no vault salesman. There is no showroom of caskets ranging from $1,000 to $20,000. And the cost of an Amish funeral, all in, often lands somewhere in the low hundreds of dollars. Not thousands, hundreds. Now compare that to what the average American family is quoted today. The typical full funeral with embalming, a metal casket, a burial vault, and the services around it runs commonly between $8,000 and $12,000, and it climbs from there. Cremation was sold to the public as the thrifty escape from that price, the affordable option, the simple option, but look closely at what happened. The moment cremation became common, the price of cremation began to climb too. Add the urn, the service, the container, the fees, and a cremation in many cities now costs several $1,000s of its own. The same industry that sold you the expensive burial turned around and sold you the expensive alternative to it. Either way, a stranger stood between you and the ground, and either way you paid him. The Amish never let that stranger in the door. And here's the part that changed how I see the whole thing. Their simple, cheap, hand-dug burial is not a cost-saving trick they stumbled into. It flows directly out of what they believe about the body. The two things are the same thing. That single idea starts to explain the refusal to burn, and if you want to go even deeper into these roots before we continue, I want to mention something that may help you. I have spent years tracing the beliefs, the practices, and the plain wisdom that the Amish have carried across 5 centuries, and I pulled everything I found into a series of books: Amish Foundations, Amish Mastery, and the Amish Blueprint. Each one takes you further inside the thinking of these communities, not as curiosity, but as something you can actually use. If this conversation is landing for you, you will find the books linked in the description below, and they will take you places this video cannot. But the deeper question still remained, and it pulled me straight into the darkest and most important book these people ever kept. They believe the body is not trash to be disposed of by the cheapest method. They believe it is a seed to be planted by loving hands, and you cannot plant a seed and pay a corporation $11,000 to hide it inside a sealed metal box and a concrete vault so it never touches the soil, and you also cannot plant a seed by reducing it to ash and putting it on a shelf. Both extremes, the expensive vault and the fire, do the same thing. They interrupt the planting. That is the thread I had been missing. To the Amish, burial in plain ground is an act of faith made visible. It is a sermon preached with a shovel. Every time they lower a plain box into hand-dug earth, they are saying out loud, "We believe this is a seed, and we believe in the harvest." Now I can already hear the objection, because I made it myself. That is fine for them. You might be thinking, they live on farms, they have the land, the neighbors, the whole community set up for it. I live in a suburb, or an apartment, or a town where I do not even know the man next door. This is beautiful, but it is not for me. I want to talk to you directly for a minute, because this next part is exactly for the person in the ordinary house who thinks none of this applies. It does. And you can act on it this week without a farm, without a barn full of neighbors, and without changing one thing about where you live. Here is the first thing you can do, and it costs nothing but a sheet of paper. Write down your wishes for a plain burial in plain words and tell your family where the paper is. The single greatest reason families overspend by thousands of dollars at a funeral is that no one wrote anything down, so the grieving are handed decisions in the worst hour of their life, standing in a showroom, too raw to say no to the man selling the premium casket. The Amish never face that pressure because the pattern is already known by everyone. You can create that same clarity for your own family with an afternoon and a pen. Write that you want the simplest available container. Write that you decline embalming, which is almost never legally required for a normal burial and which the family can refuse. Write it, sign it, and hand a copy to the person you trust. Here is the second thing. Ask in advance for an itemized price list from any funeral provider you might use. You have the right to receive one and to buy only the individual items you want, rather than a bundled package. Most people never ask, so they never learn that the casket alone can be purchased plainly and cheaply, that the vault is often not required by law but by a particular cemetery's own rule, and that many of the priciest line items are optional. The plain people negotiate nothing because they buy almost nothing. You cannot copy their community, but you can copy their refusal to be upsold in a moment of grief. And here is the third thing, the one closest to their actual belief. If a simple ground burial matters to you, you can seek out a green burial ground or a section of a cemetery that permits burial without a vault, in a plain shroud or a plain wooden box. These exist in far more places than people realize, and the cost is a fraction of the standard package. You do not have to be Amish to be planted like a seed. You only have to decide it and write it down before the decision is taken out of your hands. That is the existing life bridge, and it is real, and you can start it tonight, but it still leaves the deepest question hanging, the one you came here for. Because everything I have told you explains why the Amish prefer burial. It does not yet close the case on the person already cremated. The urn is already on the shelf. The choice is already made. What does the old Amish faith actually say about that soul? And this is the finale I promised you. This is the thing I found buried in the oldest layer of their tradition, and it is the most comforting answer I have ever come across. Go back with me to that hymnal the Amish still sing from the Asbund. It is the oldest Christian songbook in continuous use in the world. Many of its hymns were written in the 1530s by Anabaptist prisoners held in the dungeon of a castle at Passau in what is now Germany, waiting to die. The book was printed as a collection by 1664, and the Amish still open it in their services today, singing melodies so old and so slow that a single hymn can take a half hour. And the men who wrote those songs from inside a stone prison, knowing that many of their brothers and sisters had already been burned to ash in the public squares, those men wrote about resurrection with a confidence that should stop you in your tracks. They were not writing theory. They were writing to comfort people whose loved ones had literally gone up in smoke. And their answer, sung for 500 years, is this: The God who gathers is not limited by how the body was scattered. Here is the exact logic they held, and it is airtight. If cremation could prevent resurrection, then the fire of the persecutors would have been more powerful than the promise of God. Every tyrant who ever lit a stake would have won. The martyr burned in 1569 would be beyond saving, but the man who died peacefully in bed would be fine, which would mean your eternal hope depends not on Christ, but on whether your enemies got to choose how you died. The early Anabaptists rejected that idea completely. To them it was almost blasphemy. It made the flame stronger than the Savior. So they preached and sang and wrote in their prison letters a truth that the Amish carry to this day, even while they themselves choose burial. And the truth is this: God does not resurrect a preserved body, God resurrects a person. The Apostle Paul already said it, what is sown is not the body that shall be. The old body is not reassembled molecule by molecule like a repaired clock. It is transformed. The seed that goes into the ground is not what comes up, and Paul says that on purpose because he wants you to stop worrying about the seed and start trusting the sower. Ashes are just a seed sown differently. A body that decayed in the ground over a century is, in physical terms, just as gone as a body that was burned in an hour. Both have returned to dust and scattered on the wind and soaked into the earth and passed through 100 other forms. If God could only raise bodies that stayed in one recognizable piece, he could not raise anyone at all, because give it enough time and every body scatters, the whole faith would collapse. And the martyrs knew it would not collapse, because they had staked their lives on the one who said, I am the resurrection. So let me say it as plainly as those prisoners in Passau said it. According to the oldest faith the Amish carry, the faith written in the Froschauer Bible and recorded in the Martyrs' Mirror and sung from the Osbund, Jesus can and will raise the cremated. Cremation does not cancel resurrection. It cannot. If it could, then the fire would have defeated God on 10,000 occasions already, and the entire hope of the martyrs would be a lie. They bet everything that it was not a lie. And the Amish, 3 centuries later, still bet the same way. Then why, one last time, do they refuse cremation for themselves? Now you can finally hear the answer the way they mean it. It is not fear, it is not doubt about God's power. It is a choice about what they want to say with their own death. They choose burial not because ashes cannot rise, but because planting a seed in the ground preaches the resurrection out loud, one shovelful at a time, to everyone standing at the grave. It is their last sermon, and they want to preach it with the whole body, laid in the earth like the grain of wheat that Jesus said must fall into the ground and die before it bears much fruit. That is the discovery. The refusal to cremate is not a judgment against the cremated. It is a testimony for the living. The Amish are not saying your cremated mother is lost. They are saying, as loudly as a quiet people can, that death is a planting and not an ending, and they want their own funerals to shout it. So if you are holding an urn tonight, hear this. The oldest plain believers in the world, the descendants of the burned, would put a hand on your shoulder and tell you the ashes are not too far gone. Nothing is too far gone. The valley of dry bones stood up and lived. The seed you cannot even recognize comes up as wheat, and the one who made the first man out of loose dust never needed the dust to hold still. What you just recovered is not a rule about funerals. It is the thing that was quietly taken from you when death got handed over to strangers and turned into a bill, the plain, stubborn, unkillable confidence that the grave does not get the last word, and neither does the fire. You are the kind of person who suspected all along that something real had been buried under all that expense and all that fear, hidden away so that someone else could keep selling you comfort you were born already owning. You were right to suspect it. Now tell me one thing in the comments, because I read them and I want to know. Did you already believe that Jesus could raise the cremated, or is this the first time you have heard it laid out from the Martyrs' own book? Just write cremated or write buried and one line about why. I am asking you directly because this is the kind of thing people are afraid to say out loud, and someone reading needs to see that they are not alone in wondering. And if you want to keep pulling these threads with me, the buried knowledge, the plain wisdom that outlasted the people who tried to sell over the top of it, then come along. There are more of us recovering this every week. The next thing I am chasing is what the same old Froschauer Bible says about the Amish way of grieving without embalming, and the one German word in their funeral tradition that changes how they say goodbye at the graveside. You are going to want to hear that word. I will see you there. Before you go, let me say one thing. This video brought you to that ancient book, but inside the plain living circle, I take you the rest of the way. And if a question sits on your heart, ask me right there and I answer you myself, no machine. You're not alone here. Plain living folks like you already belong. Just point your phone's camera at the code on the screen, and you can cancel any time.